I now call Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr President. I commence by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. It has been for me a great privilege and a considerable pleasure to serve the state of Western Australia in this place since 2008. There's no greater honour, in my view, no greater responsibility in our democracy than for us to be entrusted by our fellow citizens with the duty to represent them, the opportunity to contribute to the legislation which protects their needs, serves their interests and shapes our great nation. I thank my fellow West Australians for their trust and the opportunity given to me to serve them in both the State Legislative Council and the Senate. Today I pay tribute to the great many community, social justice, disability, local government, LGBTI, women's, environment and Indigenous organisations and advocates that I have had the great pleasure of working with and supporting over the last 6 years. It has also been a great honour to work with Indigenous custodians who've welcomed me to their country around my state and around the nation. I have seen too much poverty, too much hardship in WA's Indigenous communities, but also extraordinary resilience, leadership and great vision. And I particularly want to thank all of those Indigenous leaders and elders who've taught me so much about Indigenous cultural economies that they have been working so hard to build and develop. And in particular, I wish the ranger programs around our country well. I want to thank the Australian Labor Party for the honour of representing our party and advancing our values. All of us in this place know that we owe our capacity to make a contribution to a great many other people. So first and foremost, I want to thank the members of the WA Labor Party and our affiliated unions for our shared values, our commitment and the many tireless hours spent together over many election campaigns. I thank Emily's List, I thank Young Labor Women and I thank Rainbow Labor for their support. I thank the ALP branches around my state of WA and their members. I know how hard all of the members of the party work to contribute and uphold our mutual values. I have some wonderful friends and comrades who've made my parliamentary career possible, and I want to pause to remember and thank the late Jock Ferguson. I thank Steve McCartney, Sally Talbot, John Ford, Jeff Gallop, Joan Kerner, Mick Buchan, Christy Kane, Sue Bowers, Penny Sharp, Joe Tilley, Ashley Hogan, Philip O'Donoghue, the Dawson family, the Comries, Shane Hill, Linda Watman, Faye Akindoyini, Eric Locke and many others who've gone out of their way to give me great support over the years. I want to thank my own union, the AMWU, for their never-ending and never-yielding support. I thank the MUA, the CFMEU, the CPSU, the ETU, the CPU and all of their officials and members. For me today, it's incredibly important to recognise that unions play a vital role not only in upholding workplace rights, but in defending and promoting the broad egalitarian values of our nation. Unions have been at the core of those values, and they are needed in our country now more than ever. I want to thank my family. I thank Greg, Fleur, Jamo, Nicholas, Elise, and in particular my mother Sandra, who's always gone above and beyond to support me, including many weeks handing out how to vote cards remote polling and early polling. I want to thank Dennis Lidlow and Stephen Dawson. And I want to pause to thank all of my wonderful colleagues in this place on both sides of the chamber. Your friendship and support and shared values has meant the world to me. I want to thank all of the parliamentary staff and officers who keep, this amazing organisation moving. It has been for me, in the time I've been here, an enormous privilege to work with people who, like me, are absolutely bursting with the conviction to want to better the fabric of our great nation. I pay tribute, on that note, to my staff, current and past, for their time, talent, loyalty, fun and humour. The humour's not always in good taste, but never mind. Justine Parker, Alana Clossy, Kate Deverell, Tanya McCartney, Nikki McKimmie, Michael Hyde, Tony O'Gorman and David Scaife, and the great many others that have volunteered their time and skills to me. I want to thank my wonderful partner Aram Hosey for his loving care and support, and for sharing what has been a demanding journey. Your own commitment to fighting for progressive values and inclusive values has always been a wonderful inspiration to me. Right. I wish, of course, that I had had the opportunity to serve longer and to contribute more in this place, but it was not to be. The events surrounding the 2013 election, the recount and the rerun, they brought home to me very clearly, as I'm sure it did to many others in this place and many throughout our community, how vitally important the integrity of our democratic processes really are. How vitally important it is to be able to have absolute confidence in the operation of the institutions and organisations that safeguard our democratic process in this nation, and indeed the laws and regulations which govern it. Very often, they have served us very well. Unfortunately, last year, that was not the case. My own personal disappointment is a minor thing, in my view, when set beside the potential for those events to undermine the trust and confidence in the electoral process which underpin the legitimacy of our parliaments and our governments. So I won't be here in this place to be part of the discussions and debates about what steps need to be taken to ensure that what happened in Western Australia in 2013 never happens again. But I urge all of you, my soon-to-be former colleagues, and all of our colleagues in the other place, to remember that the right of any government to enact any policy, of any parliament to legislate, it rests entirely on their democratic nature. And as such, the highest priority must be that the election of governments and parliaments is fair and indeed is known to be fair. I would also say on that note to members of my own party, whether parliamentarians or not, that fair, transparent and democratic processes within political parties are as important for the integrity of our system as are fair and transparent democratic elections. And this is true not only for Labor, of course, but I have had very much a front row seat to the recent public failures of Labor in my own state of Western Australia to meet that important standard. I will be part of the State Labor Conference in early July, and I really hope that the prospect of reform is made a reality. It is a challenge that we simply must meet. Again, my own personal disappointment is insignificant besides the consequences for our party and our members, and most importantly, for the men and women around Australia who depend on us. The men and women around Australia who depend on Labor to defend their right to healthcare, their right to a fair day's pay, their right to a fair day's work, and the right of their children to get a quality education. There are consequences for all those who depend on Labor to defend all those rights which together make up the Australian fair go. So too often, those who resist the democratic reform of our party, they characterise it as a distraction, a sideshow, or as focusing on ourselves. Well, as we've seen in Western Australia, that process damages more than the party itself. They damage the hopes and aspirations and the chances of those whose purpose it is for Labor to serve. So in Western Australia, those people are now facing the double impact of vicious cuts at both a state and federal level. So when we look to the issue of electoral legitimacy, we must also look to the fact that before both WA Senate elections, our Prime Minister Tony Abbott promised no cuts to education, no cuts to health, no changes to pensions, no cuts to the ABC or SBS, and no new taxes. But every one of these promises was broken in the first Hockey-Abbott budget. In other words, there is no mandate for these attacks and they have no democratic legitimacy. Labor left this government with low inflation, 1 million new jobs created in the first 5 years before the last election, low interest rates, net debt peaking at 1/7 of the level of other advanced economies, a AAA credit rating, and superannuation savings that are larger than the size of our economy. But the budget that's before this parliament is simply the Abbott government's ideological blueprint for a less fair Australia. An Australia that has dismantled egalitarian values so the rich can grow richer and leave the rest of our country behind. But these are not social or economic principles that work. Labor knows that squeezing the spending power of those on low and middle incomes means lower demand, which is in turn bad for growth in our economy. We also know that unequal access to education shuts people out of the labour market and stops them from reaching their potential. And we know that that is bad in turn for economic efficiency. Extreme disparities between rich and poor, it undermines social cohesion, it erodes cooperation and trust, and it has grave negative consequences for productivity in our country. So as you see, in my view, an abandonment of egalitarian values is not good for people, and nor is it good for our economy. Egalitarian values that have always underpinned Labor's approach to work, to income, to superannuation, retirement, health, education and more. But we have hidden in our budget papers massive cuts to many of the NGOs that support community services in Western Australia. Hidden in the budget papers, an $80 billion cut to our schools and hospitals, a cut for which there has been no consultation, not a shred of consultation, no forewarning and no discussion. Cuts that will compound what have already been devastating losses for the schools and hospitals of my state. Cuts which will hit household budgets with increased taxes and charges on a great many fronts. It is to me an absolute disgrace that Colin Barnett has been so profoundly missing from the deep criticism directed at the Abbott government coming from state premiers about the impact of these cuts on our nation. Colin Barnett, as you can see from the cuts that he has already made, is in lockstep ideologically with the federal coalition's abandonment of egalitarian values in our country. The scale of the betrayal of these values is, in my view, unprecedented. It is a budget that will see the worst off in our community hit harder not just in proportional but in absolute terms than the best off. For example, we have here low-income families with children suffering reductions of between 10 and 15% of their disposable income. So you have, for example, a couple with 2 school-aged children earning $60,000 who stand to lose just over $6,000, while those on $200,000, the impact is just $400. Think about that. Think about that. In Joe Hockey's Australia, in Tony Abbott's Australia, the harder you're doing it, the harder the coalition is going to slug you. And so that is why we have seen such anger in the Australian community over the unfairness of this budget. It is immediate and it remains white hot. It just goes to show how out of touch the Abbott government is in completely failing to realise that the fair go is a mainstream Australian value in our nation. Completely failing to realise that their hatred of Medicare is a minority view in our country. Failing to realise that despite their best efforts of successive Liberal governments, Australians in our country care for their neighbours. They care for their workmates, their friends, and not just for themselves. We have a government that is underestimating the innate Australian ethos of mateship, underestimating the capacity of Australians to extend that mateship beyond traditional limitations. It has been, in my view, an all too frequent failure of those who wish to imagine others share their own narrow view of community, curtailed by income, by race, by gender, or by sexual orientation. I am proudly on the left of my party. Those with my views are often characterised as kindly progressives, or less kindly as radicals. Either term is used to marginalise us, to imply we are extreme, or to suggest that we are a minority. I have always found it ironic that the very views that led to be labelled exactly that are those views shared by the majority of the Australian population, although quite often not by the majority of the Australian Parliament. I support the end of discrimination in our nation's Marriage Act, not because it affects me, although it does affect me, but because equal rights for all Australians has always been a touchstone for me in all aspects of my political involvement. And I assure you it will remain the case in the future. More than 65% of Australians agree with me, and if this parliament truly reflected the views of those who elect us, marriage equality would be a reality. I support the right of women to make their own reproductive choices, to not have government make those choices for them, and 80% of Australians agree with me. I've been equally opposed to laws that force women to bear children when they do not want to, and laws intended to prevent women from bearing children when they wish to. Pro-choice means the right to choose. So I'm profoundly grateful that I have been able to choose motherhood. I participated in amending laws intended to prevent women like me from accessing the same medical care as married women. I did that back in 2001 in the State Parliament. Laws that were finally changed in Victoria in 2010. Finally giving women like me, regardless of their marital status, regardless of the gender of our partners, or whether we have partners at all, access to the same legal rights to treatment as married women in this country. So despite attempts to characterise views such as mine as radical, every piece of research in this country demonstrates that these views are shared by a majority of Australians. They are mainstream views, and it is those who deny them that are the extremists in our country. It remains a great disappointment to me that my party still contains a small rump of those extremists, who exercise, in my view, power far in the excess of their number, and most certainly in excess of their support among our party's members and among our party's unions. I have spent, Mr. President, my time in this place, indeed my whole involvement in the Labor Party, working to fulfil my commitment to making this country a better place. It is a long-held and never-finished task. As a great Labor Prime Minister said once, he said, to promote equality, involve the people of Australia in decision-making processes of our land, and liberate the talents and uplift the horizons of the Australian people. And for me, motherhood will not change that. In fact, as I anticipate parenthood, I feel more commitment, more dedication and more urgency. More of this about the task of making this country one where all of us enjoy equal rights, equal protection before the law, where a helping hand and a fair go are for all, regardless of where you live or of who your parents are. And so as I think of the country that my child will live in, the future they will see, I am more certain than ever that we cannot argue anymore that the problems that affect the rest of the world can be stopped at our borders. We are more interconnected than at any time in history. Surely the global financial crisis taught us that. Surely the challenge of our changing climate shows us that. And surely the plight of refugees who have made their way to our shores also shows us that. If we want a better Australia, we must do our part as global citizens to build and create a better world. And we must appreciate that we cannot do it alone either. Our national interest demands that we be engaged global citizens, that we take part in genuine international cooperation, and that we take our share of responsibility for addressing climate change, for addressing inequality both in and outside our nation's borders. And it demands that we learn as well as teach. So in the months and years ahead, this place will see these and other great challenges for our country and our community discussed, debated, and I have to say, my faith in our democracy is strong enough for me to say that perhaps they will even be resolved. So I leave those endeavours in your hands, my friends, and the hands of those who are soon to join this chamber. I wish you well, I wish you success, and I wish you to see clearly the real needs and aspirations of those who should be the highest aim of our parliament, that is the Australian people. My own efforts to this end will be in other places in months and years ahead, but I promise you they will not cease.